Good morning, everybody. The leatherworking trades were very important in medieval London. They employed large numbers of people producing objects that were used by pretty much the entire population of London. And today I want to talk about the evidence for these trades. As part of that, I want to look at the processes that went into producing medieval leather artifacts, and in particular, how these processes impacted on London as a place and on its population, using both the archaeological and historical evidence available to us. As today, medieval London was dominated by the River Thames, and excavations of its reclaimed waterfronts have yielded often huge quantities of leather items, with more coming from buried streams, wells, and of course the city ditch, all of which offer very good preservation conditions for leather. But much of the city is too dry for the leather to survive, and so we have a patchy picture of what survives of survival, one that is dominated by dumps of material in waterlogged conditions. But we can also look to London's extensive medieval documentary sources, such as wills, court cases, letters, etc. And sometimes there are whole ordinances or laws about leatherworking, such as those in the early 14th century that forbid shoemakers from mixing different types of leather in the same shoe. And in other instances, of course, we then have just perhaps a mention of a leatherworker in passing or a name, such as in the early 1400s, when 3 cordwainers and a painter act as sureties for someone called John Tanner, who was a citizen and a scrivener. In 1422, the Brewers' Company made a list of the 111 groups of craftsmen in London at the time, and 14 of these were concerned with leather or animal skin processing and working. And the first 4 deal with the processing, so the tanners, the skinners or pelterers or furriers, as they were also called, who prepared and traded the furs used for trimming and lining garments. The white tawers, who produced the fine alum-tawed leathers that were used, for example, in glove making, and the curriers, who of course prepared and refined the tanned hides. But the remainder dealt with the working and the selling: the cordwainers, leather sellers, the saddlers, the lorriners, who made horse harness and trappings, the glovers, pouch makers, mail makers, who made saddlebags and travel bags, and where the word mail comes from, mail bags, the cofferers, who made trunks and caskets, and the leather dyers. But of course, we know from the object evidence that there would have been many other trades that are not listed in this 1422 list, and some of them I've listed here, not all of them, obviously. But I'd like to start today by looking very briefly at how leather was made in order to think about the logistics of where the trades were located. The process of making leather involved butchers, tanners, and curriers, and 2 of these trades, the butchers and the curriers, are still active as guilds in London today, but the core trade of the tanners is not. The creation of leather, of course, starts with flaying, the cutting of the hide from the carcass, which was done by the butcher. And so the tanners and butchers always had very close working relationships. The tanner would buy the skins from the butcher, usually with the hooves and the horns still attached, and the hides would then be washed to remove the blood and other material adhering to them, and the hooves and horns and fur removed. The repeated washing and soaking of the hides was an integral part of both pre-tanning and the tanning processes. And ready access was therefore required to lots of running water. Urine and dung were also important ingredients in this pre-tanning stage, and again would have required large quantities. For the tanning process, vast amounts of oak bark were required, ground up and mixed with water, and it's been estimated that perhaps a metric ton would have been required for each tan pit. The skins were placed into the tanning liquor, into lined pits in the ground, or perhaps also into above ground containers, and could remain there for months at a time. The tanning process could take over a year. In 1563, an act decreed a minimum of 12 months for outer sole leather and 9 months for shoe upper leather. After tanning, the hides were air dried, which necessitated space, either outdoors or more likely in drying sheds, which you can see in the image on the bottom there. And once dry, they were then passed on to the curriers, who would prepare them, pummeling and feeding the leather with fish oils, tallow, as well as shaving and thinning them. The leather could then be polished or coloured and was then ready to be sold on to the various leather workers. Tanneries produced, of course, large amounts of waste, both the trimmed fat, flesh and hair, which was often in quite a putrid condition by the time it was being discarded, as well as liquid waste from the washing and the tanning. And as can be imagined, such dirty smelling work attracted complaints from your neighbours. as happened in both Colchester and London. In Colchester in the early 15th century, there were complaints about the River Colne being polluted by the laying of many hides in the water. And in London, John Stowe noted in 1307 that the River Fleet, by filth of the tanners and such others, had become silted up, particularly in the northern part, where the tanners had obstructed the flow by tying their hides onto stakes in the stream. An inquisition into the state of the Fleet in 1356 mentions that 3 tanneries lie adjacent to it. So tanning was a dirty business, and pollution a major issue, particularly if like for some of the aggrieved in Colchester, you actually wanted to use that river water for brewing beer. In the early medieval period, so where was leather produced and where were the tanneries working? In early medieval London, it appears that the tanners lived and worked in various locations around the city, but by the 12th century, they had formed a distinct community with a guildhall in Broad Street. Archaeological evidence indicates that tanning was probably happening to the north of this area around Moorgate, which at that time would have been in the marshy land of the Upper Walbrook stream, again, a source of ready running water. Broad Street is running along here, just under where it says Old Clothes, and that Moorgate area is just up here. Whilst the tanners took part in the politics of city life, they were not prominent in it, and some tanners were extremely wealthy, such as Geoffrey of Houndsditch, who was the wealthiest taxpayer in Bishopsgate Ward in 1292. 15 years later, his son still had his gold ring and various other valuable possessions, which indicates the wealth of the man. But he appears, however, to have been an exception, and most were far from wealthy, which may be one of the reasons why they never became a prominent city livery company. But the tanners do seem to have formed a particularly close-knit community, and perhaps partially because of the smell and the dirt involved in the tanning trade, as well as the requirements, which always meant that it was not a trade that non-tanners wanted to either live near or perhaps partake in. By the 13th and early 14th centuries, as the City of London grew, the tanners' dwellings and yards were pushed outside the walls to the areas around Newgate and Farringdon to the west, so over here, and to Cripplegate and Bishopsgate in the north, so around over here. The Newgate and Farringdon areas on the west gave easy access, of course, to the meat market at Smithfield, up here, and also to the butchers who were located just inside Newgate in this area of the city. During the 14th century, exclusions were applied to a number of noxious trades in order to remove them from the city. And the tanners and the toyers were forbidden from practicing their craft within the city walls. Similarly, in the late 14th century, the butchers were forced to move to Stratford in the east and Knightsbridge in the west. At that time, both of these were small villages. Although by the end of the century, they were allowed back in. And it would seem that the Black Death was a sort of watershed moment for the tanners, as it was for so many others. And after about 1350, the tanners are more likely to be found outside the city walls. And it's been suggested also that from this time, they begin to form a less cohesive group, which is understandable if they're perhaps moving to mainly to the south of the river, probably, but also to the east and west. By the 15th century, there's little mention of tanners in the city, further indicating that they had largely moved out of the city, no longer operating there. There is relatively little evidence from London, however, for the actual medieval tanneries themselves, and this image is of 18th century tanning pits on Long Lane in Southwark, excavated by Mola. The faunal evidence for butchery and skinning exists in plenty from lots of archaeological sites, particularly of cattle and the other major domesticates, but sometimes also of other species. And at Lloyd's Register site at Fenchurch Street, evidence was identified for the skinning of squirrel, domestic cat, and possibly also otter. And these are all presumably for the medieval fur trades. So the main exception to this lack of evidence is the area around Moorgate, which in the medieval period was, of course, adjacent to that marshy area of the Upper Walbrook stream. And from documentary evidence, we know that there was at least one tannery here in 1298, building referred to handily as the Tanning House. And also there were leather workers. In 1301, William de Grub Lane, and his name refers to Grub Street, which is now Milton Street to the northwest of Moorgate, is mentioned as selling 3 pairs of false shoes. These had been made of sheepskin and tawed leather in imitation of cordovan leather. Archaeological excavation in the area has produced medieval pits that have been identified as possibly for tanning and leather processing. However, none of these identifications are completely secure, and they rely on the associated materials such as finds of cattle horn cores or leather waste. And of course, neither of these in themselves necessarily prove that tanning was taking place. In Southwark, a possible 13th century tanning pit has been excavated in Borough High Street, and documentary evidence indicates that the leather workers were present there from at least the 12th century. By the early 15th century, these included also a significant number of Dutch craftspeople, including in 1436, 23 cordwainers, 3 purse makers, 3 skinners, 1 girdler, and 1 currier. Most of the archaeological evidence from Bermondsey and Southwark is for the 16th century onwards, reinforcing this clear movement of the tanners and tanneries out of the city. Similarly, at Stratford, to the east of the city, archaeological excavations have found cattle skulls and teeth in pits dating to the 16th century, indicative of the skins coming to the tanners with the heads and the hooves attached. From documentary evidence, we know that in the early 16th century, Richard Parker had a tannery within the precincts of Stratford Abbey until about 1534. And the cordwainers were also working in this area, and High Street, Plaistow, used to be called Cordwainer Street in 1527. Further out at Eton in Buckinghamshire, 14th and 15th century rectangular pits with wood linings and organic deposits in the base have been interpreted as tanning pits. And skins were also sent from London to Maidstone in Kent and to Barking in Essex to be tanned, with the tanned hides returning to the city. Good quality tanned hides were also brought in from the West and from Suffolk and Norfolk, and the Suffolk trade dominated in the 16th and 17th centuries, with tanned hides and calf skins being shipped from Ipswich and Woodbridge directly to London. But of course, the finest leathers were those imported from Spain, as well as furs from the Baltic and other skins. In 1283, there were special brokers appointed to deal with negotiations between the Spanish merchants and the Londoners who bought their wares. And from the 14th century onwards, however, this trade suffered from war and the increasing hostility between the two countries. Once the tanned hides were ready, they were brought in to be sold in the city, and both hides brought in from abroad and also those produced in or closer to London. By the 1240s, the tanners' Seld or market had been established on Cheapside, almost opposite St. Mary Le Bow. So you're right in the heart of the medieval city at this time. A number of tanners sold from there at any one time, and it was a long and narrow building with rows of tables and stalls on which the hides were displayed for sale. Each stall or table was used by an individual tanner, and these were handed down within families or passed back to the Society of Tanners. Unenfranchised or foreign tanners were supposed to use a separate cell on Friday Street, which was a less good location, a little bit further out from the centre. In 1313, there were about 18 tanners holding plots of the main Cheapside cells, but by 1400, this had fallen to 4 or 5, and gradually the area becomes more associated with leather sellers, those dealing in the finished goods, such as girdlers, saddlers, cofferers, and cordwainers. From around 1400, the publicly regulated markets for hides was located to the north of the Guildhall, and later in the 15th century, it moved to Leadenhall, which remained the main leather market into the 19th century. When the market followed the trade generally and shifted south of the river to Bermondsey. By the late 18th century, a third of all the leather in the country was produced in Bermondsey, which became known as the land of leather. And the leather, hide and wool exchange was open there in the 1830s. And the image on the right here shows Bevington's tannery in 1862. And it also probably gives us as good an idea as we can have of what a medieval tannery would have looked at. Probably hadn't changed enormously. And although the tanneries and the leather trades have gone from Bermondsey, a walk along Bermondsey High Street shows that the traces of it remain in the names of restaurants, cafes, wine bars, as well as the street signs themselves. But I now want to move on to looking at the people who were involved in the trade and how these were organised, starting with the role of women. So tanning was a trade where daughters could learn the trade and could take part in it, although it must be said in general that in comparison to some other trades such as brewing, women were less prominent in the medieval period as independent traders than men. Skinning and tanning, of course, were very dirty, very physically demanding trades, which was often difficult for a widow to continue to work in. And it's more likely that women took an active role in the selling of the leather. Derek Keane's work, based on information about 25 tanners' widows who lived in London between 1280 and 1370, indicates that in the 14th century, wives and daughters did assist husbands and fathers in the leather trades. But it seems likely that it was as daughters that women would have learned the craft of tanning, or learned about it. And this may have contributed to this dense network and kind of close family relationships that seem to have characterized the London trade. It's likely that daughters may have been allowed to learn the trade to save money. As mentioned, many leather trades were not that wealthy. And therefore, many would have learned the craft as a family member rather than as part of a formal apprenticeship, which meant that it lacked the formal public recognition. And I want to finish by looking at some of the leather-related livery companies in a little bit more detail. And starting off the cordwainers, the term cordwainer, of course, refers to those who made shoes. It was first used in English in 1100, and it derives, of course, from the name for the city of Cordoba, which was known for its fine Moorish leathers. Cobblers, by contrast, repaired the old shoes and were forbidden from making new ones, and disputes regularly broke out between these two groups, such as in 1455, when the Chamberlain has to step in to resolve a dispute between them. The term shoemaker is a late medieval one. And then to further complicate matters, the term cordwainer is often used as a general term for a leather worker, so you can't always rely on it totally meaning a shoemaker. A guild of cordwainers was in existence in London by 1160, and it was incorporated in 1272. In the late 13th century, when the city was divided into wards, the cordwainers were the only craft guild to have a ward named after them, and this indicates their prominence by this time. Their ordinances regulated their work and decreed that they should not tan leather and vice versa, and the fact that they're actually specifying this usually means that, of course, it was happening. From the beginning of the 13th century, the cordwainers were grouped around what became known as Cordwainer Street and is now part of modern Bow Lane to the south of Cheapside. The curriers and other leather workers were also located in this area. The Cordwainers' livery hall stood from 1440 just south of St. Paul's Cathedral, west of Bow Lane, and the site is now marked by a blue plaque. And the statue that you can see illustrated here is of a cordwainer. It's located on Watling Street, just off Bow Lane. But as we know, we know that shoemaking was going on in London prior to mention of the cordwainers in any records. Archaeologically, many sites in London produce fragments of leather waste, offcuts and trimmings, and you'll see some fabulous Roman examples at the back there. And these come from, of course, shoemaking and cobbling. And in the area between Bucklersbury and Bow Lane, archaeology indicates the presence of leatherworking there in the period between 1000 and 1150. And again, this is a period where we have much fewer documentary sources. But leather offcut waste is found elsewhere in the city too, and it's a fascinating source of information, as I'm sure many of you know. Analysis of this waste can tell us more about the trade and the work involved. And these pieces show us the one on here, this side, sorry if you're online, this little one here. You can see the kind of teeth from the clamps that might have been used to stretch the hide. These are fragments, trimmings from the edge of the hide that wouldn't have been used. And here someone's tried a little bit of practice work for their interlace, not work on a piece of waste. So always look at your waste fragments is the answer, is the thing. The evidence from archaeology for footwear indicates a very organized trade serving many different customers from at least the 10th century and constantly developing and changing in response to fashion. And this is reflected in the documentary sources, which give an insight into the costs and the quantities of the shoes being made. In the 13th century, Henry III and his queen Eleanor gave gifts of shoes to the poor, sandals to the friar preachers of London at the major religious festivals. The shoes cost 5 pence a pair, and the sandals 10.5 pence. And this is at a time when average pay was between a penny and 5 pence a day. In 1247, one order was for 315 pairs for the poor, and in 1253 for 510 pairs. 10 years later, sandals were given to 700 friar preachers, and these numbers give an insight into some of the orders which cordwainers, London's cordwainers, were regularly fulfilling. Some of the surviving leather also, of course, indicates the skills of many of London's cordwainers. Patterns were blocks sold, almost clog-like overshoes that protected one's feet from the messy London streets. And they were not very common in London until the 15th century. The earliest medieval patterns are wooden, and a few date to the 12th and 13th centuries, but they really take off in terms of fashion in the later 14th century when they were made of stacked layers of leather. And you can see examples, just this one here. The first pattern makers are mentioned in 1379 as a group, and since the 15th century, they've been associated with St. Margaret Patton's Church at the junction of Rood Lane and Eastcheap in the city. The Glovers were granted ordinances in 1349, and they're a good example of the ways in which some of the companies adapted to change over time. They merged with the pursers in 1498, and in 1502, the two merged with the leather sellers. However, in the 17th century, changes in fashion meant that elaborate gloves became hugely popular and fashionable again, and the Glovers seceded from the leather sellers in 1639 to form a separate company once again. Gloves were worn widely in medieval London, and we have examples here of both more workaday gloves, leather gloves and mittens, and then the finer tawed examples for the wealthy, made from sheep, goat, deer, or horse. The girdlers were made leather girdles or belts, often highly decorated with metal studs and mounts, and they were granted letters patent in 1327, with their first charter granted in 1449. They have a long association with the Church of St. Lawrence Jewry near the Guildhall in London, and their livery company still stands nearby. But to finish, I just want to speak here about the evidence that we sort of don't have, or we have very little of. Little survives archaeologically that can be identified as clothing, although we know that leather clothing would have been enormously, very, very common. We also have little information on how this trade was organised. There's no mention of a discrete guild for leather clothiers, for example, in London. Tudor jerkins, such as this one, are one of the few items of leather clothing that do survive. So I hope that all of this has given you an idea of the significance of the leather trades in medieval London, but also an idea of how much we still have to learn about them, where they were located and how they were organised. And finally, to show that the collections and the written descriptions do tally sometimes, here's a lovely description by Chaucer, which could also be used, of course, to describe this piece, where he talks about someone having shoes that look as if St. Paul's windows were carved onto them. And then we have this lovely little tiny fragment of shoe. So thank you.
Right, our next presentation is from Stella Carson, who is a student at Uppsala. You're still a student at Uppsala University? I just in case you graduated even consistent bio. It's about to, yeah. So yes, we look forward to your presentation. Thank you for coming over and talking to us today, Stella.
So, well, yes, I'm Stella, and I'm here to talk about species selection for leather production in late Iron Age Scandinavia, with a special focus on a place called Valsgärde. It is located a couple of kilometers north of Uppsala, and it is a late Iron Age cemetery. You can see the hill to the left there. It's a hill on the river banks of the river Fyris. And it was discovered in 1928 when the local farmer was digging for gravel at the side of the hill, and suddenly a horse cranium just fell out that had a golden bridle, and they thought, here we have something. This was later to become Valsgärde 1, the first boat grave at the site. And Uppsala University proceeded to excavate this hill for the next 24 years, and it turned out to find around 62 cremation burials, 15 inhumation and chamber graves, and 15 boat graves, which will be the main focus for today. The earliest graves are from the pre-Roman Iron Age that spans from about 500 BC to year 0. Then there was a hiatus around 400 years after the first graves, and then the site was continuously used up until the very early medieval times in Scandinavia. But here we have boat grave, one of my favorites, number 8. It is very typical for the period. It is a Vendel period grave. The boat graves come from the Vendel and the Viking Age, around 560 CE to 1050 CE, and they are rich warrior graves. As you can see, we have 2 very nice shields there. There's a helmet in the middle. We have 1 sword in this one and 1 scrum of sacks that are a little bit more to the right. But some of the other graves contain up to 3 shields, and they have 2 swords and 2 scrum of axes, and there are arrowheads and spearheads and everything. This means that these graves are representative of the higher elite warrior graves, but I do believe that it's still representative of the leather material for the larger society, because these people still lived in the rest of the society. Apart from the rich warrior gear, which they are most famous for, these graves also have a high, rich organic content, Valsiade 8 here, for example, contains several kinds of wood. There are bone, there's fabrics, and they have pillows and bolsters of down and feather, and of course, leather. Why the preservation conditions are so good, we don't really know. The hill is quite sandy and dry compared to the landscape around, which is very flat and have heavy clay soil. But we're lucky to have it. Also, they are unburnt and haven't been plundered, which was really common during this period for other graves. They also contain a lot of evidence from trade from very far away. These helmets are quite similar to, for example, the Sutton Hoo helmets. The shields are also very similar. And they have garnets from India. The shields have other shields that look the same in other parts of Scandinavia, like Birka in Sweden, Nidam in Denmark, Gokstad in Norway, and Tira in Latvia. So this was a broader context. Some glass vessels are from England, and gaming pieces are from northern Norway. The one we see here is made from walrus bone or walrus tusk, and a lot of the other ones were made from bone from whales. So my idea was, why not leather? There are other evidence in the broader Iron Age perspective of combs that turn up in every other grave during the Iron Age that are made from antler from deer or reindeer, which suggests that there was a trade with antler from northern parts of Sweden to the southern parts in Uppland and Gotland. And also bear claws in the burnt graves and lynx claws that show that there was a very large export of furs that turns up in the burials. These peak during the migration period and then are really common in the Vendel period and Viking Age as well. Some of these animals were even hunted close to extinction. And studies show that this outland exploitation, while thought to have belonged mainly to the Viking Age, seems to have started already in the Vendel period. So my questions here are, is the leather from Valsiade locally produced, or was it imported as well from the northern parts of Sweden? Can we find any reindeer? Can we see a connection to a specific object type for specific species? And is there a possible connection to these imported leathers as a status marker? So I chose to do this by the SOMS analysis. Or Archaeology by mass spectrometry. It is a protein analysis that mainly analyzes collagen that turns up in bone, antler, eggshell, and of course skin material. It's also possible to do on keratin, but the reference libraries aren't as good yet. And here you see my first little batch with 10 samples going to University of York. The first trial batch was sent in the autumn of 2022, and it was 10 samples. And the main idea was to just find out, does it work on this material? Because the SOMS analysis that have previously been done have mainly been done on rather wet material that has been waterlogged. So we were a little bit worried that it wouldn't work on this very dry leather. And therefore we focused on using already fragmented material, sending only a few pieces to see if it worked. And it did. So far, so good. The success rate was around 60%, not brilliant, but definitely good enough to continue. Most of the results are on family level, but we continued and had a little bit more of a sampling strategy for the second batch. We have 4 different groups. The first one, green bridles and horse tack. Almost all graves contain horses or horse-related items in some way. Most contain both, like stirrups, reins, horse skeletons, and such. I believe that the metal fittings that you can see, the little bronze studs, maybe I should show this one. The little bronze studs here, and the fittings have contributed as well to the preservation, which is why we have rather large pieces in some cases, actually. This is both bridle pieces. This is a headband from Valsiade 6, and this is a bridle from Valsiade 7. And as you can see here, there are at least 3 parallel rows of this kind of sewn decoration. And there's a similar purse in Birka that has the same type of decoration, but the extra thread is actually gilded leather, which makes a pattern that is very similar to the little bronze studs that you can see here. The round ones there, I don't think belong here. I think it was an overexcited conservator in the 30s. So it's only supposed to be the small ones. Second group is sword scabbards and scramasax scabbards. They are made by having a wooden core that have really intricate patterns carved into them, and then very thin leather is glued on top, which means that they had to be very skilled both to create this leather, to carve the patterns, and then to apply the leather onto the wooden core, which I think is absolutely fantastic. You can see the little person standing here with his hat and everything. I don't think it's really visible in this picture, but he's also tied around the neck, the hands, and feet, so the detail is quite high. Then we have shields. Not an awful lot of the leather parts are preserved on the shields. Both of these pictures are from Valsiade 8, which has the best preservation, but the pieces are instead rather large. At least Valsiade 6, 7, and 8 had leather on both sides, according to the excavation reports. Some of them have metal rims, as the one you can see here. These mainly belong to the Vendel period, but they turn up in the Viking Age as well. The rest that doesn't have the metal rim probably had sewn rims instead, as can be seen in, for example, Gokstad and Nidam, but there isn't enough wood preserved on the other shields to prove this, but the shields are similar enough in other ways to make this a fairly educated guess. I think here as well that the leather part, the metal parts might have contributed. The rim is from iron, but you can also see the green copper alloy studs there and the little piece of leather by the edge. Then we have other items, the extraordinary ordinary. This is a little bit miscellaneous group where everything else ended up. It's a variety of straps and leashes and well, different unidentified leather things. Also contains 2 or 3 pouches that contain coins, glass beads. I think there's a dice in one of them as well. So in the second batch, we had another 44 samples. So there's a total of 54 samples that was sent here, including 2 reference samples from another dig in Uppsala from a 13th century dig at the town square. But as you see, we have around 70% success rate. Most of it is definitely cattle, probably cow. Several of the species suggested can be excluded for geographical reasons. I don't believe there are any giraffes in here, or pudu for that matter. So I chose to add the cattle group and the bovidae group to each other because they are very similar, and both of them are probably cow. Another alternative is aurochs and Vicent. They do exist in Europe at the same time, but they have been extinct in Scandinavia for a couple of thousand years during the Iron Age, so it is more likely that it was good old local cow. As for the groups, we have the bridles and the scabbards. Both of them all turned out to be cattle or cow, which I find very interesting, as these present both the thickest straps and the thinnest straps, still made from the same species. We have the shields that are a little bit of an outlier. However, it is important to remember that this represents, I think it is 5 samples that comes from 2 different shields. We have front and back side, and we have a handle, but all of it turns out to be goat. There is a bovidae cervidae group here, but the common denominator of alternatives show that it is consistently goat. This is also consistent with the findings from a shield that was taken from Birka, where the facing of the shield is also made from sheep, roe deer, or goat, but the edge is made from a thicker leather on cow. I wonder why cow and everything else and goat for the shields. Then we have the other items group. Hardly surprising that they have the greatest variety of animal species represented, because they are the greatest variety of objects as well. The only thing that turned out to definitely be goat here is the little piece of the knife sheath that you can see here. I hope that you can see the pretty little sewing holes at the edges as well. It might be that this group of bovidae cervidae represents my little reindeer, but considering the preference for domesticated animals, it is more likely that this is, for example, sheep or more goat and more cow, though not in all cases. So, what does this tell us? First of all, leather seems to be locally produced. There are no reindeer here. Darn. Though opens for new studies because we still need to find those reindeer. Trade is still possible, but probably more on a local scale rather than the far-fetched northern Norway. Cow wins by far, and this is consistent with other findings from similar studies of, for example, shoes and other shields and things from Denmark and from Birka and other parts of Sweden. Also, the Hallstatt mines show that domestic animals were preferred, and later in the Middle Ages as well. The Vendel period has a greater variety than the Viking Age, which is also consistent with the graves. The Vendel period was much blingier, and then they calmed down a little bit in the Viking Age. There is also an interesting thing about the osteological investigations from the area around Gamla Uppsala and Valsgärde, where they show that both horse and cow increase incredibly, and they probably bred both cow and horse for meat production. Cow, not so surprising. Horse, a little bit more interesting because this is considered taboo in many parts during this time. It also doesn't turn up at all in the leather. And if they had such a high production of leather or such a high production of horse meat, what are they doing with the skins? One suggestion might be that it was actually taboo to deal with the skins for some reason, but it might also be that horse just does not work as a leather, as several tanners have told me. And this makes me wonder that perhaps I was completely wrong in my idea that we imported leather. Instead, maybe the Uppsala area exported leather, mainly from cow then. And last but not least, my final conclusions. Soemas is an effective method on this type of material. Hooray! It is very unlikely that other animals weren't used for leather, but they don't turn up here. Instead, domestic animals are definitely preferred, and all other types are created from the same type of animal. Of course, there's a difference in age and sex, like a grown bull compared to a young calf, but still. And I, as a crafter myself, find this very nice because that means that the skill of the crafter is the most important part of this process, and they didn't really choose specific animals for certain things. They took the cattle leather and then they created what they needed. And with this, I show you my favorite grave, Valsgärde 7, and thank you for your time.
Well, next we've got a talk from Lucy-Anne Skinner about Egyptian leather mummy braces, tabs and pendants. And Lucy's doing her PhD in ancient Egyptian leather, so this is going to be very interesting, I think. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for allowing me to the opportunity to talk to you today about leather from ancient Egypt. This presentation concerns, it's one aspect of the PhD that I'm sort of coming to the end of, which I conducted through a combined doctoral partnership with the Institute of Creative Leather Technologies at the University of Northampton and the Department of Egypt and Sudan and Department of Scientific Research at the British Museum. One of the aims of my PhD research was to look at the types of animal that were used to make leather in ancient Egypt and Nubia. And by this, I mean the animal species or the breed, the age of the animal as well when it was slaughtered. So I've examined and analysed objects dating from right from the pre-dynastic era so over 4,000 years BC, to the late antique period at the end of the first millennium AD. The sort of information that you can get that's interesting about the animal provenance is, I think, really because of the close connection between animal skins as a byproduct of animal slaughter and animal management practices at the time. For instance, hunter-gatherer groups would have used wild animal skins, such as gazelle, and then when animals became domesticated, there was an increase in domestic animals, of course, being used for skins, as pastoralism became more common, with sheep, goat, and cattle herded by semi-nomadic groups, and then later animals utilized as part of farming economies or for transport and as status symbols, as was the case with horses during the Pharaonic period, and perhaps connected to the fact the horse was not slaughtered for meat or connected to any Egyptian deities. I haven't found any instances of horsehide being made into leather, not until after the Roman conquest of Egypt. So the hide and skin type can help us to infer information about whether people were eating meat or using animals for dairy or fiber production, depending on the number of wool or hair sheepskins you might find, or goat or cattle hides. And this would be easier if the sex of the animal could be discerned, but unfortunately, it's usually not possible to tell this. Sometimes skin types used to make leather have provided information about belief systems as well, and ceremonial practices involving animal sacrifice. If I can just draw your attention to the timeline, the objects I'm talking about today are actually from period highlighted in grey, so from the third intermediate period in Egypt. The second aim of my PhD was to establish how the skins of different animals were used and for what purposes. For instance, Nubian clothing was made from leather with the grain surface removed, forming garments such as skirts. And as seen in the image on the left, they're often coloured with red or pale cream coloured or yellow colorants. And we've analysed these and find a lot of instances of ochres used. And then the example of, and so actually also the skirts and so on, and the clothing from Nubia, often it's made of sheep or goat skins.
Online?
Oh,
I'm sorry, so sorry too. Hi, sorry, we're just having a little bit of a technical issue. You telling me, guys, that the slides are not moving forward? Is that right? I'm gonna. Can you see? Can you see that slide change?
Oh, so it's not, look, this is what it looks like online.
you just see the first. Oh.
Oh, okay, sorry.
All right, so
Okay,
wrong view.
just let me fix this for you. Why has this done this?
I think we stop screen sharing.
Yeah, I'll just stop screen share and start over. Sorry, guys. So sorry about this. Which one are you in?
There's the Zoom first.
Can I just grab some water?
Yeah, of course.
There's a glass right here. Oh, yeah.
Let's see about that. Where were we?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, so sorry about this.
Okay.
Broke your flow.
That's all right. For people online, I could just I can go back. Should I go back? Yeah, for people online, this was the second slide. So just with the timeline and different animals. Yeah, so I just talked to you about the clothing leather, garment leather from Nubia. And the picture at the top left actually is a Nubian woman wearing a sort of coloured leather skirt. And so we think probably that when we find this kind of leather with a lot of stitching in it and different colours, that possibly it's from skirt leather. And also we sometimes find drawstrings from the waist as well. Okay, so then in Egypt, we have Egyptian objects such as leather chariot casings, as the one that you can see on the second image. And they were made typically from goat skin. Then there's Egyptian footwear, which is usually produced from cattle or calf skin with goat skin uppers and straps and edgings. In each case, the choice of animal type for these objects was, for practical reasons, to do with the performance requirements of the objects and how well the animal skin type suited these uses. There were also some more unusual skins used, such as perforated leather loincloth shown on the right-hand side of the image, of the slide. So they were worn in the way shown in the image above by Nubian captives and Egyptian manual workers. The example shown is a very small loincloth, and it would have fitted probably a child. And this loincloth is made from gazelle skin. It's possible that gazelle was used for practical reasons and for comfort, because wild animal skins are said to make very strong leather, and antelope skin is very soft, but is at the same time, it's possible there were other reasons that gazelle was used. So perhaps because of religious beliefs and taboos. And I'm going to talk more about that later in this presentation. So this slide introduces the main topic of the presentation, which is a type of object known as mummy braces or mummy stola. The word stola comes from stole, I think that's how it's pronounced, which is a liturgical scarf type garment worn by ordained priests. Mummy braces date to the 1st millennium BC during the 3rd intermediate period. They consist of 2 long ribbons or straps of red stained or glazed leather, which were placed on the deceased shoulders, crossing over the chest and hanging on the upper back. The intention of mummy braces and pendants may have been to connect the mummy with Osiris, who is often shown wearing stola across his chest, as shown on the slide on the bottom left. And also, you sometimes find the stola on mummy cartonages and mummy coffins, like the example from the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, which is from Nectefmut, which is a cartonnage mummy case. Stola were also represented on mummy wrappings, as shown in the center image, which is from a mummy called Istemkeb. It's thought that this way the stola provided protection and divine status to the deceased. The ends of the straps of the stola terminate in what are known as tabs, which are these trapezoidal shaped inserts or of uncolored or faintly yellow colored skin or leather. And these tabs had red leather backing and edgings on them. The inserts are typically produced by embossing the skin or leather with small images, which generally represent a ritual scene and short texts. In most cases, the only surviving part of mummy braces are these embossed terminals, the tabs and pendants. And they sometimes, or they always, pretty much always have fragments of the ribbon, the stola, also attached to the top edge of them. And each specimen shows a consistent pattern which is a combination of an image which represents a scene that involving two people. On the one hand, it's either a king or the high priest of Amun, and on the other side, a deity. And some texts, and also some texts on there as well. So when the embossments are legible and the king or the high priest can be identified on them, the dating of these items is very straightforward. There are the two types of pendant as well. So at the bottom row, these are slightly different from the tabs, and they weren't attached to the stola ribbons, but they were attached to like strips of leather instead. There are two shapes of these. One is the shape of what's known as a menat counterweight, and it's a symbol of divine protection associated with the goddess Hathor, and it's worn as a counterbalance behind the neck to keep heavy necklaces in place. And then one which is in the shape of the menket, which is a tassel, and it may represent the provision of clothing for the afterlife, but also Menket was a lioness goddess associated with the eye or daughter of the sun god Amun-Ra. And so incidentally, actually in the story about the Eye of Ra, where she ran away to Nubia, and during her return to Egypt, bringing moisture back to the country, she took the form of a gazelle at one point of the story. Pendants are normally placed on the mummy's neck or chest, and they're bound, as I said, bound with a piece of leather. In the British Museum collection, there are 16 mummy tabs and pendants that I have investigated and analysed to identify the animal provenance of the different parts of the leather, in both the leather backing, the remains of the stola ribbon, and the embossed front plate on them. And the rest of this presentation is going to demonstrate sort of how I carried out the investigation of animal provenance, and also how I discovered information about how the mummy braces were made, and which part of the animal they came from, and colorants and embossments as well. So I'm sure you're all aware of the most simple way of determining animal species of leather by examining the grain follicle pattern on well-preserved leather. So after the hair has been removed and the skin from the skin or the hide during processing. I use this method as an initial way of distinguishing between calf, sheep, goat skin when working in the field or in storerooms. And I had this kind of mobile kit that I use. Another morphometric technique I used during my PhD was measuring the thickness and proportions of the grain and corium in the leather samples. This is quite difficult because usually the leather is compressed or in bad condition, or the edges are kind of covered, so it's quite difficult to look at the proportions of the grain and corium. And also it tends not always to be a very precise method with archaeological skins, but also if the skin happened to have been reduced in thickness from behind, as typically happens with modern cattle hide, at least, where they split the skin in half, and then you find that you might have a similar thickness to calf skin, and you should be able to tell the difference between split cattle hide and calf skin by the proportions of the grain and the corium within it. But as I said, it's often quite difficult because of deterioration. I'm not going to go into details about this today, and I've discussed it in another paper previously. But the most useful technique I've determined, not only for species identification, but also breed identification, is to use these kind of 5 and 2 millimeter square quadrats that, so you can record the grain follicle pattern within a known area, And this way, skins and hides can be compared to each other, even if they've been photographed with different magnifications or within different fields of view. And so, yeah, I won't talk about that today, but so then also what I've done is used, where I've taken these 2mm square quadrats, I've used them to determine the follicle hole density measurement. And this technique involves counting the number of primary hair and secondary hair follicles that you have on within this 2mm square area, as shown in the slide. And different animals have different, first of all, follicle hole densities overall, but also different proportions of primary and secondary hair follicles, depending on whether they had primary hair. So wool sheepskin, for example, doesn't have primary hairs, but it has all secondary hairs. Whereas hair sheepskin has a combination of both primary and secondary hairs. So it's actually turned out to be a really kind of intuitive method, very useful method. So with goat skin as well, for example, where they have primary and secondary hair follicles. So you can use that as a way of telling between various different animals. And deer skin actually is an interesting one as well, because they have a very high overall follicle hole density, but they have quite a low number of primary holes, and a very large number of secondary holes, because they have such dense underfur on their skin. And follicle hole density measurements can also be used for investigating age of the animal, or to give, I mean, obviously we know that calf skin has a much higher density of follicle holes than adult cattle skin. But this method actually really gives, it obviously provides a sort of more quantitative method of really assessing it. But something, I won't again talk about it so much today, but it's really been very interesting, is that different breeds of animals, so you can have an Egyptian cattle as opposed to a European cattle, and the Egyptian cattle have a much higher follicle hole density than a European cattle. So it's really important when you want to try to do this kind of work, to try to build up a very big reference collection of different animals and compare them all with each other. And it's all basically to do with hair type, obviously. So in Egypt, the different climate means that the animals have different kind of hair. But yeah, so it's really good for determining whether you've got calf or cattle hide. So one of the as well as sort of doing a primary kind of examination, oh God, I've also done zooms analysis on, and I won't go into the details because that's not really part of my talk. So we were talking about sampling before, so it's been quite interesting in that I've been able to sort of compare, when I get a good result and when I get a bad result, and often it's to do with the sampling technique that I've used. So I've used it's called e-zoom, so the triboelectric technique, where you rub a razor onto the skin, and I've done basically taking tweezer samples of the skin, and also just detaching or taking samples from the mounts and so on. And one of the problems I often have is contamination. So for distinguishing gazelle skin from sheep skin and goat skin, from goat skin, it's relatively easy, because if you have the certain peptides, you can tell when you've got goat skin. Sheep and gazelle are very similar, apart from one single peptide. So if at 1550 or 1580, you can distinguish between sheep and gazelle. So some of the zooms results for these mummy tabs. This is the one single example where I actually found something other than gazelle, and it was, this is calf skin. So the result was quite clear that actually this was made of, well, it came up with cattle, but obviously it's very thin leather, so I can pretty much say that it's for certain that it's made of calf. And then for all of the other zooms results where it worked, and it didn't always work, but I did have a very good success rate considering how old these objects are, being about 3,000 years old. But I had a lot of positive results for gazelle skin for these mummy tabs. But the thing about zooms is it's not always, you know, guaranteed. And as I said, there's just one single peptide where you can distinguish between sheep and gazelle. So I did a lot of this morphometric examination to try to distinguish the animal species as well. And but what I found was that, you know, obviously we have a lot of reference material when it comes to sheep, goat, cattle, but for gazelle, there's pretty much nothing available. So I started from scratch building a reference skin set and compared it with other animals. Gazelle has a very consistent cross-section with the hair holes. You can see that they don't penetrate very far into the skin compared to other animals. Sheepskin from wool so it tends to be very loose and open, whereas gazelle is much tighter. And then I also prepared these grain follicle pattern quadrats from different areas of the gazelle skin, so from the shoulder, the back, the butt, and so on, so that I could actually maybe try to determine from which area of the animal the skin may have come from, or the leather may have come from. Another thing I was looking at was what I'm calling grading. So just it's used more in the leather industry for determining sort of the quality of skins. But I found that it's quite nice, it's quite useful for sort of showing, you know, the differences in sort of texture of the grain and how loose or tight it was, and the coarseness of the grain and so on. And what I found with gazelle skin was that the general pattern is this very horizontal lines of follicle holes. But in some areas, there are these very vertical stripes, and that's to do with during the life of the animal, where there's a lot of stretching going on in the skin, you get these kind of vertical lines. But it's also to do with the hair type of the gazelle. So having this kind of very, very pronounced marks on the skin. I also try to look at looking at hair on a lot of the leather that I was looking at. Obviously, with these mummy tabs, they don't actually have any residual hair attached to them. However, I have noticed that there is a really big influence on the quality of the skin, depending on what kind of hair type that the animal had. And that's a lot to do with the root of the hair. So like cattle hair, for example, have these very wide roots that kind of continue in the same diameter as the hair shaft, whereas antelope hair and deer hair are very similar, and they have very thick diameter of the hair with a big medulla. However, in the root, there's no medulla whatsoever, and they taper down. They're called wine glass shape. They taper down to this very fine tip. And that just means that in the skin, you can kind of fit more hair. So you can have very thick hair on the surface, but on a small animal like a gazelle, you know, you can fit it into the skin, and it doesn't actually jeopardize the quality of the skin by having these vast hair roots, which would disrupt it after you remove them. So it's an adaptation to do with heat tolerance and so on. So a lot of these adaptations with gazelle you find is to do with the hair type, and its adaptations to with heat. With the mummy tabs, so first of all, of course, I prepared these quadrats of the grain follicle pattern in 5mm square. And you can see it's very regular, and there does seem to be this kind of horizontal stripes of the follicle holes, but it's not particularly clear. And also it's not so easy to, at this point, to distinguish between what I know is from the zooms result is calf skin with the pink one on the right side, and the other two, which are made of gazelle skin. So these are the follicle hole density for gazelle, and generally they're very, very even. They're very regular with gazelle, mainly because it's a wild animal, so there are no breed types whatsoever. So pretty much if within one species type, the hair is always going to be the same. But it does vary a little bit in the different areas of the skin. And with the mummy tabs, I found that the ones which were gazelle skin are really consistent with my reference skin, whereas calf skin has a total follicle hole density of 108, which is about double what gazelle skin has. So even though they both have only primary hair, they as I said, they don't have any residual hair, the mummy tabs. However, they do seem to have these stumps of hair within the skin, which seem to be very straight, but that's obviously not really enough to be able to do an identification with. The overall results, I found that almost every single mummy tab is made of gazelle skin, with the exception of the calf. There were a couple of occasions where I wasn't able to tell, but other than that, they're all made of gazelle. The other thing I've done is using RTI, first of all for grading the skins, but also for looking at how they were made. So it really highlights the kind of obviously the very linear structure of the skin, but it also shows up various details like these vertical lines that you can see on this slide. And I think this is remnants of this mold, or the dye mold that they used to make the embossments. Perhaps it was made of wood, and this is the kind of the grain, the very sort of parallel grain pattern of the wood that you can see in that. I've done some experiments with trying to mold leather. This was actually for a different project. It wasn't for the, it wasn't looking at the mummy tabs. It was looking at scales of leather armor, and have found that it's not really possible to mold skin that has been lipid tanned. I put lipid tan, basically fat tanning with, it depends whether it's oil or fats or whatever, brain it could be, but it's not really possible to mold skin when it's been lipid tan, especially not if it's been softened. With raw hide, obviously you can mold it really easily. None of the mummy tabs have been vegetable tanned. I've tested them and I know that they're not, and we think that they're all lipid tanned.
Wind up, I'm really sorry, I'm giving you extra time.
Yeah, sorry, okay. Okay, so also I've been comparing areas of the skin, so looking at you know, which part of the body it came from, and you can really tell that by looking at, again, the follicle patterns on the skin in different areas. I mean, it's useful to know this because different areas of the skin have different qualities and are used for different purposes. And I've got a method that I use, which is for orientating the skin, assigning it like a north-south or east-west direction. I can tell you more about it afterwards because I don't really have time to talk about it now. But basically, then once I have established an orientation for the skin, you can kind of almost virtually place it on the skin and to figure out where it might have come from. So these are the mummy tabs with the orientation of the follicle holes, which is also in the same direction as the fiber direction of the skin. And then, so then what I've done is sort of almost virtually placed the pieces of the mummy tab onto the gazelle skin. And the lines that you can see on the gazelle skin kind of mark the direction of hair lay. So different animals have very slightly different hair lay. So cattle, it tends to be from the backbone to the belly, and goat, it's more like a kind of diagonal. But with gazelle, it's very, very vertical from the head to the tail. And then looking at life record, but I won't talk about that because it's just looking at sort of scars and so on. And then, yeah, finally, one of the questions was, why were they using gazelle? And it's thought that because it's so consistent, we know that they're all made of gazelle, that it's actually connected to religious practices rather than for practical reasons, because there's no reason why they couldn't have used goat skin to make them, but they chose to use it to make them out of gazelle.